Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for getting up early. This gives me an opportunity to come back to some of the work I've done in Dresden, but I will also show some recent work. The world is facing a number of new global and intensified problems. We have financial issues, we have an economic crisis, a debt crisis in many countries, we have social and political instabilities in many countries, in many continents, global environmental change, cybercrime is exploding, and we obviously need to understand our society better, including the interactions between society, the economy, technology, and the environment. We have networked the world, and networking is good. It has come with an exchange of people, of money, goods, and ideas, and it has created so many new opportunities, services, and everything. But at the same time, we notice that actually the very same network infrastructure also creates pathways for disaster spreading. And here's one example. In Germany, on November 4, 2006, a ship of the Meyerwerft had to be transferred, and for this, one power line had to be switched off. That was known in advance. It was simulated also, but there were, by coincidence, some other problems that basically led to a cascading effect within seconds, and after a few minutes, actually, the problem had spread all over Europe. You can see the complex pattern that has actually resulted from that, and it shows us that those network systems are really difficult to understand and predict. Here is another example. We have learned yesterday that supply chains are about three different flows: flows of materials, flows of information, and flows of money. What you see here is the bankruptcy cascade that happened after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in the United States, and hundreds of banks actually went bankrupt, and it created a loss of hundreds of billions of dollars. So yesterday we've been discussing about systemic risks of supply chains. If we consider the financial sector to be part of a supply chain, then certainly there is a systemic risk, because we're still struggling with solving this problem, and we don't know how it will be done and how many more years it will take. There's one important thing to notice. Networking tends to increase actually the functionality of the system, but only to a certain point. And of course that depends on the specifics of the system. Here we are looking at cooperation in a social dilemma situation, but the surprising thing is, as we go on, networking first, cooperation goes up, but then we get to a level after which cooperation eventually erodes and goes down to zero again. And the question is, are we taking that into account as we increase the complexity of financial systems, of information systems, and of supply networks? In fact, as Andy Helbing of the Bank of England has pointed out, the connectivity in the banking system was actually going up dramatically in the past years, particularly in the years before the financial crisis, so that could very well have been the root cause of the financial meltdown. I think this is something that many of us are possibly not fully aware of, and so we need to think about connectivity much more, not just as an enabler, but also as a factor underlying systemic risk. Talking about systemic risks, one can also ask, what about China, for example? How long will it be stable? Will it be stable forever? I mean, basically, it's the production house of the world. A lot of things, from shoes over food over technology, is produced in China these days. Well, here it's worth having a look at a graph which shows how countries are governed. And you can see that there is a transition from hierarchically organized or autocratic countries to democratic countries as the GDP per person exceeds a certain threshold. And also the fertility of families actually plays a role here. But GDP per capita is really important, and that means as an economy flourishes, the society gets to a point where a different way of governance seems to be needed. And my interpretation is that this relates actually to the higher level of complexity. High levels of complexity cannot be managed anymore in the best possible way top-down, because there's not even today, and also not in the future, enough computer power to do real-time optimization of that complexity. So decentralization is needed, and that means a participatory form of governance. Another point here is when we talk about food, that actually those political unrest and the revolutions in Arabic countries have been largely triggered by high food prices. And as food became expensive, it became interesting to speculate with them and with food at financial markets, and so it became even more expensive until people couldn't pay for it anymore. And you can see the clear correlation here between high prices and political unrest, and it also shows you how many people have been dying in those unrests. So it could be 10,000 people. So this is something that we need to consider certainly when we try to understand systemic risks. Now coming back to China, this is a projection that Jürgen Niemkes has made. If we really believe that GDP per capita is the crucial variable, then a transition in the political regime of China might happen somewhere between now and 2020. Yeah. It's of course nothing that we can rely on. Of course, we have seen that it depends on triggers. It can happen sooner or later. That's something that we know about phase transitions from physics. But certainly we need to be aware of the possibility that China, as we know it today, might not be stable forever. And so the question is, what would that mean for our supply chains? In fact, there is an additional problem that we are now facing hyper-connected systems. That means we have made all sorts of systems interdependent. Production systems from information systems. Production systems are coupled, of course, with the energy supply system. Production also depends on health. Just think of pandemics. And so everything basically becomes interdependent. Global warming is an issue because food production actually might move from one place to another. That will cause migration, and migration causes other problems. We've been looking recently at the resilience of the European gas supply. The interesting point here is that there are basically three main suppliers. One is Russia, one is Scandinavia, and another one are the North African countries. Which is a little bit scary because we know that the political situation in some of those countries is a little bit unstable, and gas supply could be used also as a means of producing political pressure. We're highly dependent on this. This year actually, Great Britain had a gas reserve of 6 hours left. There was no crisis, but still, we got into this situation, and we need to be aware of the potential vulnerability of the system. So interesting is the following consideration. Just assume that one of those three areas would not deliver gas to Europe anymore. How could we deal with that? So we would have to use the pipeline network in a different way from the way it was actually designed for, and that would create bottlenecks and congestion in areas where we wouldn't expect it. We will have to handle this congestion in order to have the best supply of the remaining gas. And it turns out that there is a way of doing that. We've been working about a fair, optimal fairness that will create the best possible distribution. So leaving it just to the market may not work, because then some countries may not have enough gas at all. And that requires basically a coordinated strategy within Europe in order to handle such a situation, but it can be done. So if these kind of procedures are applied, Europe is surprisingly resilient to one of the big gas suppliers. Supplying areas would not deliver anymore, but basically the procedures need to be fixed before to work in case it happens. We've also recently made some studies about epidemic spreading, and as we know, epidemic spreading is a very complicated problem. The patterns in space and time are complex, predictability is very low, which you can see in the wide scattering of these data points. But surprisingly, it's possible to reduce the complexity of this and actually understand the dynamics of epidemic spreading, and things become pretty much predictable, as those clear linear lines are showing. So that allows us actually to better prepare for pandemics and have immunization and medical tracks in place where infections are expected next. All of that is, of course, important for global supply chains. Just remember how SARS impacted the economy in a number of countries. Now, what can we do? One important lesson is strengthening strong links doesn't help. We have to strengthen the weak links, and actually we have also to consider engineering breaking points to be able to stop cascades. While everybody of us has such a device at home in order to avoid a local problem from burning down your house, we haven't had such kind of breaking points built in our financial system. And the question is, why? Every network should have such kind of engineered breaking points. And it's irresponsible not to engineer networks in such a way. They can be engineered. Just we need to make sure that economists and engineers and natural scientists would talk to each other and learn from each other. For supply chains, the opposite problem might be relevant. So we need to have prepared alternative paths of delivery and production. But the main point is that we need to be able to run networks adaptively, and if possible, to adapt in real time. There are a number of issues that destabilize the networks of our world. We are reducing redundancies in order to save money. We are networking our systems more and more. Complexity goes up, the dynamics is increasing. And also we have a high pace of innovation, which generally is not a bad thing, but it also takes time to learn the side effects of innovation. And so we might not be able to handle them in time if we don't basically check out innovations carefully enough before we apply them. There are a number of possibilities also to address vulnerabilities, and this includes backup strategies, real-time feedback, self-organization principles, and we'll come back to this, diversity, limitation of system size, or reduced connectivity, or dynamic coupling or decoupling strategies, which is common in some systems but uncommon in others. I'm now turning to another problem, which is complex dynamics. So far we've been talking about complex structures, now complex dynamics. And we know that complex systems are limited in terms of predictability. Weather forecast is a good example. They work for a short time, but also only probabilistically. And the same thing can be expected actually for large networks, dynamical networks, in particular supply networks on a global scale. Another thing is the illusion of control. Complex systems are governed by an internal dynamics. The coupling between the components is strong. That creates self-organization and emergence. And it means that those systems are hard to control from the outside. And a typical thing that you might find is that if you try to change the system for some time, nothing happens. So then you decide you have to try a little bit harder, and still not much happens. So you think, okay, make it a little bit harder again, we'll get there. And suddenly there is a regime shift to a completely different kind of system. And that is just one of the things that can happen actually in complex systems. And the question is, what can we do then in order to ensure that a system is well organized and stable? Self-organization is a possible approach, but also a problem if we do it in the wrong way. So just have a look at this circle of cars. We would think it's not difficult to drive at a constant speed, but after some time there is a fluctuation. This fluctuation causes a so-called phantom traffic jam, and we won't get rid of this anymore. Now, if I would ask people, in particular those drivers, what was the reason for this, they would say there was a stupid driver in front of me who didn't know how to drive a car. But we have mathematical models to understand these kind of phenomena. And it turns out that when the density exceeds a certain threshold, then a small variability in the speed will be amplified and will cause a chain reaction. That means the next car will respond with a delay, and that's why it needs to brake a little bit harder. And the next one again and again and again, and finally everybody is stopped, although nobody wants this. This is a good example for a system with a systemic instability, and it tells us that in such systems which are systemically unstable, things will sooner or later get out of control, even if we have good technology, all the information that seems necessary to do the job, and if everybody is highly motivated to do the right thing. And the conclusion is, we just need to make sure that we're not operating systems in an area of instability. For this, we need to know our system and identify the parameter regimes that are stable or unstable. Now have a look at this. So in the morning, of course, the density of traffic is increasing, and as a result, the flow is increasing as well. And what we do in a production plant is that we go to the point of maximum efficiency, right? Where the throughput is highest, where we produce most goods per hour. And let's do that in our traffic system. I mean, we're going up to this point, but then unfortunately it turns out this is also not just the most efficient point, but also an unstable point. So that our system breaks down, we lose capacity, and we end up in a situation where we produce less products per hour. And unfortunately, this kind of thing happens exactly at the time when we need our full capacity during the rush hour, right? So, can we handle these kinds of situations? I'll come back to a solution approach later on. Now, I'm trying to convince you that traffic jams are also relevant for production systems. And in fact, John Sturman's beer game is exactly kind of traffic jam phenomenon for production. And this game has been played by Paul Schönsleben with not just students, but also managers who should know how to run a production plan, how to order supply. And it turns out also managers can't do it, as they are also producing traffic jams. And so there is again the problem of inherent instability, and that can be modeled mathematically. So that is kind of the inventory over here that changes with time, and those are the rates at which the supplier receives ordered products, and that is the rate at which the supplier delivers products to the next downstream supplier. And if you look at the dynamics, then we also need to consider that it takes time to adjust your production to a changing demand. And the time is considered over here. Of course, we are trying to anticipate the future situation also in order to compensate for this. And let's try to find out how these different factors matter and basically impact your supply chain. Wow. Here's a phantom traffic jam in your production. That's the bullwhip effect. You know, we start with very small variations, negligible almost, but they're amplified largely. And so the question is, does this produce booms and recessions? Are recessions just traffic jams of our world economy? I'll come back to this later on. We're varying here a number of parameters of the model, in particular the time delay it takes to adjust your production to the demand. You can see if you're quick enough, then there's no problem. You will not have the bullwhip effect, but beyond this point over here, it will happen. You can't avoid it from happening. If you're not good in predicting what happens, so this is the time prediction time horizon, and you can see that if your prediction capability is large, you might compensate for the delay in adaptation. Now, this was just a linear supply chain, the most simple thing you can imagine, and it already goes wrong under many conditions. What might happen in a networked supply system? That's a usual situation, of course. And you can come up with mathematical equations for this as well. I won't go into details over here. So we have adaptation in delivery rates. We have an adaptation of prices. We have consumption that varies a little bit. There's a fluctuation term in here. And of course, we assume that resources are conserved. So you can take it to produce something else, but you know, copper stays copper, basically. And now, the beauty of a model is that you can make some fundamental investigations. And it turns out you can be in one of 3 different situations. And that results from one of 2 different kinds of input-output matrices that describe you where your material comes from or where it goes. And if this is the input-output matrix, it might have real eigenvalues only, and then you can have these two situations, an overdamped behavior or damped oscillation. That means your system would sooner or later go into an equilibrium. That's what you'd like to happen. However, most of those input-output matrices would have complex eigenvalues. And then you can have one of those two cases. One is damped oscillations. That's all right. But growing oscillations is what might happen as well. And that's what you need to be concerned about. So the question is that of any importance for real supply networks? And we've been looking into global commodity flows. So industrial chemicals, for example, are needed in agriculture. Agriculture feeds into wood production, and that goes into construction, for example. And so, this graph shows you the main interdependencies. And that can be done, of course, for any country. We've done it here for an average of France, Germany, Japan, UK, and US. And what you find is oscillations, as we find it in our real economy. And in fact, these are booms and recessions that come out of the model and are a result of delayed adaptation and the network structure. So we could maybe design the network in a different way so it would not produce instabilities, would not produce booms and recessions. I've never seen people talk about it and try to find a network that would do exactly this. There are other people who have been looking into production interdependencies, and I recommend you to have a look also at this paper, The Product Space Conditions the Development of Nations. And it also shows you that there is something like a production ecosystem that matters for the overall well-being of your economy. If some of those species are missing, your production ecology breaks down. And I think we have seen that in a number of countries as certain kind of production has been moved to Asia. Somehow the ecosystem has changed, and it was not good for many countries in Europe and probably for other countries as well. And there are marked differences between industrialized countries and other areas in the world. So the ecosystem matters, actually. Now, I've also been looking at the question, can we change the structure of the supply chain in a way to dampen those oscillations, the bullwhip effect? And so, for example, I've been looking at those three different examples. Any linear supply chain can be organized also in this or that way. And you can see this is producing really large bullwhip effects. That is already a little bit better, but this almost dampens away all your oscillation. Quite interesting. So why don't we do that? Well, in fact, Intel has learned to do that. I'm not sure whether they know why they have ended up with this structure exactly. They will have had their reasons, of course. But it's exactly this structure that I found in our theoretical analysis to be dampening oscillation. So that's interesting. I consider that some empirical support for our theoretical approach. I then wanted to talk about a project we have done with Infineon Technologies, where we have found an interesting slower is faster effect in production of chips. But for the sake of time, I have taken it out, and if there's time left, I will show it to you, okay? Here's another example. It also shows a slower is faster effect. Container transport. Globalization has come with a number of benefits. So some of the harbors in Germany, for example, have been growing a lot. And the number of goods that have been transported through those harbors has increased. And that has created problems because you have to handle that. And here is one of the container terminals. So here are the ships, then ships are unloaded, and the goods are stored in a container area. But the unloading and the loading happens with so-called automated guided vehicles. And so they run along virtual tracks. And it turned out that they're losing a lot of time just standing in each other's ways. And so we said, because we have learned that actually from a pedestrian study, we said, why don't you run those automatic guided vehicles more slowly? And so let's compare the situation that they had. That was the run time, the movement time. That is the waiting time, much bigger than actually the moving time. And that's a variability. And so reducing the speed of those vehicles means that there's a reduced safety distance that you need to keep. So they're not standing so much in each other's ways. And that means there's more runtime, less waiting time, and overall, you're doing a better job. Slower can be faster because it helps you to coordinate the processes. That needs to be considered at times where you're saying, okay, you have to be faster all the time. And I often feel that's making systems more inefficient. The question is, can we learn from other kinds of sciences and systems? We've also been looking at production plants in paper factories. And it turns out that, first of all, the problems that they thought they had were not the problems that they did have. And second of all, we found out that much of the problems that they had can be understood in terms of a generalization of traffic theory. So under certain conditions, bottlenecks develop, and that creates missing quantities downstream, but also jams that are propagating upstream. And it takes a long time, again, to resolve those jams, as in traffic as well. So let's talk about traffic then. Maybe we can learn something from it. So there are a number of systems, actually, where we have a similar problem. Like everybody wants to get to the center at the same time. And then we find these terrible traffic jams in almost every city of the world. But we have a similar problem within our own bodies. In every single cell of our body, we have transportation of certain kinds of chemicals towards the nucleus of each cell. It's the same problem. It's a flow towards the center. And so the question is, why doesn't that produce congestion? If it would, we wouldn't live long. In fact, there are some diseases where this transportation system is not working properly, where congestion is produced, and these are terrible diseases. So how did nature figure it out? Well, it had millions of years to do that somehow. We call that evolution, but we might be able to learn from that. And there are a number of tricks. So what is happening is that there is a fusion of small so-called vesicles, and that changes the ratio between surface and volume in a favorable way. Then there's a purification process. It means the stuff that's not really needed here is taken out. And finally, there's non-uniform motion. That means those vesicles are not moving towards the center at a constant speed and then finally basically stepping on each other's feet. Now they have an irregular motion. They basically wait in some distance and then finally they sprint. Here's another system that might be worth looking at. Ants. Ants are very efficient, and to our surprise, they're capable of avoiding traffic jams, even without technology. So, swarm intelligence, self-organization, why don't we use that? I think it's worth thinking about it, but there are even more dramatical possibilities that are now coming up, which is big data. In a few years, we'll have more data than we could even think of. Maybe we are already in that situation. So what can we do with these kind of data? Well, we could actually do a real-time measurement of global supply networks. And that would allow us, in fact, to do some forecasting and compensate for those delays in adaptation that we have. In this way, stabilize supply chains, prepare for food crisis or whatsoever. So it would be possible. It takes us to decide this. It would probably be good for every company to have more information. And here is an example. We've been working in particular on driver assistance systems and on inter-vehicle communication. And so far we have these annoying stop-and-go waves. And that, of course, should change. And the question is, how can we do it? We know that the interactions are causing the problem. Those interactions are creating those amplification and cascading effects that finally create the traffic jams. And there are very small perturbations. Those few cars that are trying to get in are triggering off the process. We're now speeding up the presentation, but the inflow will stay the same all the time. But now we're turning on what we call a traffic assistance system. That's a special adaptive cruise control using radar sensors to measure the distances and relative velocities and drives your car automatically in a way similar to how you would do it, just better. And you can see, after a short time, we can get rid of the traffic jam because basically we have changed the interaction. We call that mechanism design. We've changed the interaction in a way that stabilizes the flows and slightly increases the capacity as well. And we can do a similar thing actually for traffic networks. So classically, these systems are controlled by a control center. But one day I thought to myself, couldn't we use self-organization to do the job, to produce green waves? And we have noticed that pedestrians at bottlenecks show oscillatory flows as if there was a traffic light, but there is not. It's a dynamical pressure principle that is creating those oscillations. So we were transferring this self-organization principle to intersection. You can see it's producing wonderful green waves. And it has benefits for motorized traffic. That is a case study that we did for Dresden, for that area where the city basically gave up on. But you can still improve the situation for individualized traffic, for public transport, and for pedestrian and cyclists. And the same thing is also good for the predictability of travel times and for our environment. So why don't we do that? In fact, Dresden is now implementing the system, and I hope other cities will follow. So I've been talking a lot about complex systems. And our classical approach is to do top-down control. We've done that also in a number of countries in the past and still today. This kind of approach, the local optimization of intersections, corresponds more to what a Homo economicus would do. That's kind of the current market organization that we have, where every company takes separate, independent optimizing decisions. And it turns out this actually performs better than this approach, and we know that, otherwise we wouldn't have those markets. It performs better, but only to a certain point. When we challenge the system too much, it actually loses performance and coordination breaks down. The invisible hand of Adam Smith doesn't work anymore, but we can make it work with additional information that allows those agents, in this case the companies or states or whatever the agents may be, it allows them to coordinate with their interaction partners, with their neighbors. So this is actually the approach that I've shown you in the past slides and which works best. So I suggest that we are in a transition to a new form of organization of our markets and of our economies, and I believe actually that social media are playing a major role in enabling this coordination. Thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Florian Lücker from EPFL. I have a remark regarding the Bullwhip Effect. Recently there were 2 econometric papers that were trying to measure the Bullwhip Effect, and they found out that there was an amplification factor of 2 or 3. And in your model there was a factor of 250, if I've seen correctly. So the econometric results were regarding supply chains. So maybe you were modeling a complex process, or?
Where do you see the 250?
If you go back further. Here. Oh.
Yeah, this is a linear one. Are you referring to linear supply chain?
Yes,
I
but
mean, all of this, of course, depends on parameters, and that is certainly an oversimplified model.
Okay.
Yeah, no question about this. But the most important message really is here to understand that there are potential instabilities in these kinds of systems, and that will create undesirable effects, and that we need to find solutions to overcome these problems, and there are actually solutions for this.
Okay, and my second question was regarding these metrics where you GDP per person and the democratization of fertility was on the x-axis. So I guess you have taken a choice of countries, because Arabic countries, for example, that are highly non-democratic but have a high GDP per person. Or then you could also think on the other side, maybe Latin America, Chile is a very relatively democratic country, maybe comparing to Italy. And at the same time, the GDP per person is quite low. So they are not in the graphic, I think.
So this is not my own work. It's work by Jürgen Miemkes. But as far as I remember, Arabic countries have been considered here. These are countries that tend to have a high number of children per family. And that's why they've been staying in this area for a long time. But basically, this kind of analysis seems to suggest that the transitions to less autocratic regimes should happen now, yeah, in not all, but in many of those countries, as we're actually observing it. So he suggests that we could have actually predicted this kind of transition.
So let me ask a question with respect to self-organization of these networks. At the moment, I believe we have this something like a top-down trial of a control. Some of it is well controlled, some of it is probably not as well controlled. How should we then move on to this? What are then the rules for which should be implemented on bottom level to move on to this self-organization? Has this something to do with this the notion of resilience we have talked yesterday about it, which probably changes the complexity of the system, which is almost this behavioral aspect of resilience? Do you see it in this connection, or how do you see it?
It's an interesting point, and I'd like to remind you of something that Yossi Sheffi has said yesterday. He said, in the state of crisis, I think he was talking about the automobile industry after the tsunami. The best thing is if the management doesn't interfere, doesn't tell those different departments what to do. They know best what to do. They know they need to find a solution. What the management should do in that situation is enable, support the communication between the departments, and basically provide the means that allow those departments to do their job. So I found that extremely interesting. And that basically shows the power of bottom-up, in particular in the state of emergency. If there are experts that have experience, obviously, in their field and who want to get the job done and know they need to work together, right? The question is, how can you basically implement that into technology for an everyday situation? And we have also been working on such an approach, basically assuming that each product you produce has an RFID chip with some information. And so as this product goes through the production plant, it basically tells the machines, hey, I want this to be done. And so this product and the machine start communicating with each other. And of course, the machine talks to many products and then takes a decision in what order things will be done. But in principle, with this kind of technology, it's possible to take decisions locally in an adaptive way and allow your plant to self-organize. It's just a matter of what kind of technology you're using. But it's here now. And so from that point of view, I think production can be kind of re-engineered. And self-organization has this beautiful feature that usually it's quite resilient to perturbation. So it can recover. The decentralized approach is also more robust as compared to failures of control centers. Centers are vulnerable also to cyber attacks and so on. So from this point of view, decentralization has a number of favorable aspects. And of course, you can combine both approaches and you have the benefits of both, bottom-up and top-down.
May I add a question to that? So if you're looking at your highway, you assume all your cars have this RFID chip. So would that mean if we go back to reality, and so industry would have to decide, yes, we let our shipments communicate with each other, so but this was almost an industry decision along a supply chain, or how would that?
Interesting, the traffic assistance system I've shown is working already with equipment rates of 10 to 20%. It's very effective, and that also basically enables new market entry strategies. Before, many technologies for improving road traffic require that all cars are equipped, and so the question is, how would you ever get there? If people have to pay for a technology that will work only in 5 years, when all the cars are equipped, so it would never come. But interestingly enough, already a small percentage of such superiorly equipped agents can enable the whole system to perform better. And we are doing now actually a study about the financial system, where one of the big problems is bubbles and crashes. And people have often said, okay, we cannot predict bubbles, apart from Didier Sonnet, who says he has a method to do that. But assume it's not possible to say this is a bubble or this is healthy growth. So what would you do? You would basically try to destroy bubbles before they're large. And in physics, we know how to do that. We add noise. And such noise can be added in principle by random trading. And so we have finished a very first, probably oversimplified study that is showing the positive effect of such noisy trading on the market. If only 10% traders would do that, would reduce the size of possible bubbles dramatically. And we are now exploring that further. So there are possibilities, even if not everybody is changing the strategy, to improve the performance of the system really dramatically.
So I think for reasons of time, there's only one further question. Nick, yeah.
Hi, thanks for that. I was just curious, in one of your early slides, you talked about cooperation going down, I think, as network complexity goes up.
In social dilemma situations.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit more background on that?
All right, this is about, as I said, social dilemma situations and other situations where cooperation would be good for everybody. That means it comes with a high payoff. But if everybody else cooperates and you don't, you have an additional payoff. So there's a temptation not to cooperate, and that can create an erosion of cooperation and end up in a so-called tragedy of the commons, as we know it actually from overfishing, global warming, free riding, tax evasion, and many other problems actually that are really hard to get under control. And there are a number of mechanisms that enable cooperation. This is actually, I would think, a major point about our civilization, finding such mechanisms. And one of those mechanisms is neighborhood interactions, for example. So local interactions tend to benefit cooperation, and as you go on globalizing, it becomes less local, and that is kind of the mechanism that's destabilizing the system. You could also think of it as the interaction becoming more anonymous, because reputation systems, for example, are doing a similar job as local interactions or repeated interactions. There are many mechanisms actually that can promote cooperation, but some of those mechanisms are undermined by globalizations and others not. And I am very much supporting the establishment of a global reputation system in order to stabilize cooperation on a global scale. That would transfer the success principles of communities to the global village. Just the important point is to create those systems in a pluralistic way. So the users would basically determine how to mine the rating and reputation data. It's not good enough if there is one company or one institution that does it for us. It's okay if there's one institution or company that's collecting those data, but it should be allowed that everybody has an own perspective on these data, because we trust certain kinds of information sources more than others, and that's very important that those reputation systems cannot be undermined.
Yeah, please thank the speaker again.